December 17th, 1944. Deep in the frozen Ardennes forest, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper does the math. The tanks of his elite Kampfgruppe have enough fuel for perhaps another 40 miles. The success of Hitler's last great offensive on the Western Front rests not on their firepower, but on a rumor, a ghost, a whisper of a massive American fuel depot somewhere up the road. For Peiper and his men, the war has been stripped down to a single, desperate question. Is there a gas station ahead in the fog? For some of those German units, the gamble paid off. They broke through the American lines and into a world they could barely comprehend. This is the story of what they discovered inside those captured supply depots, from fuel and warm winter coats to chocolate, coffee, and mountains of ammunition. We will document their stunned reactions, often in their own words, but this investigation reveals a stunning paradox. If the Germans seized a treasure trove of everything they desperately needed, how did this incredible prize become one of the key reasons their entire offensive was doomed to fail? To understand how a battlefield victory became a strategic liability, we must first see the two worlds that were about to collide. By the winter of 1944, the German war machine was starving. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, which had begun in earnest that May, had systematically dismantled Germany's synthetic fuel production. Output was down by over 90%. For the common German soldier, the Lanzer, this collapse was felt not as a statistic, but as a daily, grinding reality. It was the taste of ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns. It was the worn-out soles of his boots and a threadbare greatcoat, never intended for the brutal cold of an Ardennes winter. Most critically, it was the crippling lack of mobility. The very image of the Wehrmacht, the lightning-fast panzer thrust, was a ghost of 1940. Now, even elite panzer divisions, the tip of Hitler's spear, were tethered to the slow, primitive pace of horse-drawn wagons for their food and ammunition. The entire German army on the Western Front was running on fumes, a few days of combat supplies and grim determination. Just a few miles away, across a front line the Allies had come to call a ghost front, existed another universe. This was a world built by the Red Ball Express, a logistical artery of unprecedented scale that pumped the lifeblood of American industrial might directly to the front. In the supposedly quiet Ardennes sector, this abundance had accumulated into vast, sprawling supply dumps. The U.S. First Army's main depot complex, spread across the area between the towns of Spa and Malmedy, held nearly 3 million gallons of gasoline. And it wasn't just fuel. There were warehouses stacked to the ceiling with K-rations, chocolate bars, and real coffee. Mountains of ammunition, tires, and spare parts. Crates of new, warm winter parkas and waterproof combat boots. To the American quartermasters, it was a standard, if massive, logistical footprint. To an army on the verge of collapse, it was an unimaginable treasure. This staggering imbalance was not a secret to German high command. It was the central calculation. Hitler's plan for the offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, was therefore less a military strategy and more a blueprint for the largest armed robbery in history. The panzers would launch with just enough fuel to break through the American lines. From that point on, they were ordered to fight on captured gasoline. The success of the entire operation was not a contingency, it was a prerequisite. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the plan was set in motion. A massive artillery barrage shattered the pre-dawn quiet of the Ardennes. The spearhead of the attack, SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper's elite Kampfgruppe, crashed through the thinly held American lines near the Losheim Gap. For the next 24 hours, they fought and advanced, burning through the last of their precious fuel reserves. By the morning of December 17th, the panzers and tigers at the front of the column were running on fumes, just as High Command had predicted. The offensive was on the verge of grinding to a halt. Then, just east of the village of Bulge, they found it. Not a rumor, but a sprawling, unguarded American fuel dump. Thousands upon thousands of jerry cans, stacked in neat pyramids. Eyewitness accounts describe a disciplined but frantic scene. Panzer crews worked with desperate urgency, forming human chains to pass the cans, siphoning the high-octane American gasoline directly into their thirsty tanks. In just a few hours, they captured an estimated 50,000 gallons. For Peiper, it was a moment of stunning success. Hitler's impossible gamble had paid off. With their tanks full of captured fuel, the Kampfgruppe accelerated its advance deep into American territory. They believed their hunt for fuel was over, but they were about to discover a level of material wealth that would challenge their entire understanding of the war. The fuel from Bulge was a godsend, but it was just the first glimpse into the American world. As Peiper's column smashed deeper into the Ardennes, his men began overrunning forward positions, aid stations, and small company headquarters. What they found there stopped them in their tracks. It was a land of plenty. In abandoned dugouts, they found wool blankets, fresh socks, and new winter boots still in their boxes. They saw rations unlike anything they had ever known, cans of meat that heated themselves, white bread, real butter, and oranges. One German officer, Werner Pizar, would later recall his utter disbelief, calling it a land of milk and honey. For soldiers who had subsisted for years on black bread and thin soup, the sight of half-eaten plates of food, left behind in the haste of a retreat, was a profound psychological blow. They found crates of Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, and tins of actual unadulterated coffee beans. A grenadier from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, fighting nearby, wrote in his diary, "We found a box of donuts. We ate them all. I don't know what will happen to us, but for one day we lived like kings." This wasn't just loot. It was evidence. Proof of an enemy whose industrial power seemed limitless, whose lowest-ranking soldier lived better than a German civilian. The abundance was both a prize and a poison, planting a seed of doubt. How could they ever defeat an enemy that could afford to be so wasteful? Back at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, the initial reports were a chaotic mess of panicked dispatches, but as analysts plotted the German advance on their maps, a single horrifying pattern emerged. The German spearheads were moving too fast, too far. They were outrunning their own supply lines. There was only one possible explanation. On December 19th, General Eisenhower's intelligence chief, Major General Kenneth Strong, presented the grim conclusion. The German offensive was literally being fueled by captured American gasoline. The entire plan depended on it. The realization was immediate and absolute. The Allied war machine's greatest strength, its overwhelming logistical superiority, had been turned into its greatest vulnerability. That same day, a top priority order went out from the highest levels of command, cascading down to every quartermaster, engineer, and supply clerk in the path of the German advance. The order was simple and brutal. Deny the enemy. Deny him everything. What followed was a desperate, scorched earth race against time. The men tasked with this mission were not elite combat troops. They were truck drivers, mechanics, and warehouse clerks of the quartermaster and engineer corps. Suddenly, they were on the front line of a new kind of war, a war of logistical denial. Their job was to destroy the very supplies they had spent months carefully accumulating. Near the Belgian town of Spa, one of the largest fuel dumps on the continent held over 2.5 million gallons of gasoline. As Peiper's Kampfgruppe drew closer, a small detachment of American engineers was given the suicidal order to rig the depot for demolition. They worked frantically, laying charges among the tens of thousands of stacked fuel cans. They were not just fighting panzers, They were fighting time. On December 18th, with German reconnaissance units just miles away, the charges were detonated. The resulting explosion was colossal, sending a pillar of black smoke thousands of feet into the winter sky. For the advancing German tankers, this dark column on the horizon was not a target. It was a tombstone, a sign that the prize they were chasing had just been vaporized. The captured abundance now began to reveal its hidden costs. First, it destroyed the single most critical element of the German plan: speed. While German High Command imagined a disciplined, lightning-fast seizure of key objectives, the reality on the ground was different. Verified reports from multiple units confirmed that the advance was repeatedly slowed as exhausted, half-starved soldiers stopped to loot. It wasn't a universal breakdown of discipline, but 1,000 small delays. A squad pausing to gorge on canned fruit. A tank crew stopping to strap crates of cigarettes to their vehicle. Joachim Peiper himself would later rage that his men's obsession with American luxuries cost him precious hours. For an offensive measured in minutes and miles, these delays were fatal. Second, the captured resources were not the perfect solution they seemed. The fuel captured at Billingen and other small dumps was often high-octane aviation gas, not the lower-grade gasoline German tank engines were designed for. Using it risked fouling spark plugs and causing long-term engine damage. And for every small depot they captured intact, 2 or 3 more were now found to be smoldering ruins, destroyed by retreating Americans. The Germans were winning tactical skirmishes, but the trail of burning depots ahead and the growing American resistance on their flanks meant Peiper's spearhead was becoming dangerously isolated. The hunt for fuel was on again, and the gauge on the lead Panther was dropping once more. But while Peiper's men were distracted by captured luxuries, the Allied High Command was not idle. The initial shock had given way to a cold, calculated response. Eisenhower had unleashed his theater reserve. Elite, battle-hardened units like the 82nd Airborne Division were being trucked into the Ardennes at maximum speed. Their orders were not to meet Peiper's armor head-on. Their mission was strategic. They were to seize the key crossroads and bridges at places like Verbelmont and Trois-Ponts, the vital arteries behind the German advance. The map was changing by the hour. Peiper's spearhead was no longer a breakthrough. It was a vulnerable salient, a 20-mile-long shooting gallery flanked by growing American power. The hunter had become the hunted. The initiative had decisively shifted. By December 19th, blocked from advancing and with his escape routes systematically severed by American engineers and paratroopers, Peiper realized the hunt for fuel was over. The war had become about survival. He ordered his remaining forces to consolidate in the small village of Gleize to form an all-around defense. His mighty King Tigers, out of fuel, were about to become the world's most expensive pillboxes. The village of Gleize became a cage. For 6 days, American artillery and air attacks had hammered Peiper's defensive pocket, but the final killing blow came from within. The streets were now an open-air museum of the Reich's most fearsome weapons. Panther tanks and the colossal 70-ton King Tigers sat silent and cold. Most had not been destroyed by enemy fire. They were simply out of gas. The very resource their entire offensive was designed to capture had run dry, turning an armored fist into a static, helpless target. On Christmas Eve, 1944, a final radio message crackled through. It was not an order to fight to the last man. It was an order to break out, to save what was left of his men. Peiper made the calculation. He would have to abandon everything, all 135 of his remaining armored vehicles. Every tank, every half-track, every artillery piece. In the pre-dawn darkness of Christmas Day, Peiper and around 800 survivors, many of them wounded, slipped out of the village on foot. They carried only their personal weapons and whatever they could scavenge. They left behind a graveyard of pristine advanced machinery, a multi-million Reichsmark monument to a gamble that had catastrophically failed. The fuel captured at Bullingen hadn't won them the battle. It had only carried them deep enough into a trap from which there was no escape. The story of Kampfgruppe Peiper's hunt for fuel is the story of the entire Ardennes Offensive in miniature. And it answers the central paradox, how a treasure trove of captured supplies helped doom the German attack. First, the captured wealth was an illusion. American scorched earth tactics ensured that what the Germans found was a tiny fraction of what they needed. The millions of gallons of fuel vaporized at depots like Spa were strategically more decisive than the thousands captured at Bullingen. Second, the supplies became a distraction that cost them their most valuable asset, speed. But the most profound reason was the psychological shock. For the average German soldier, the sight of American abundance was a crushing revelation. They were not fighting an equal, but an industrial superpower that could produce and waste on a scale they couldn't even comprehend. The captured supplies weren't a path to victory. They were a symptom of an enemy's unassailable strength, an enemy whose logistical system was so robust it could absorb the loss of entire depots, reroute the flow, and still supply the very forces that would surround and crush the German advance. In the end, the German offensive was not stopped by a new weapon or a heroic charge. It was broken by the simple, brutal logic of an inventory report, a final accounting that proved the war would be decided not on the battlefield, but on the loading dock.